Hey guys, in this video I'm going to take you through the process of unpacking a metaphor, which is what you need to do to analyze a metaphor. By the end, you might even be able to tell me why that unpacking a metaphor is a metaphor. Alright, but we'll start with a simple definition. A metaphor is when you say one thing is another thing. But the important thing about metaphors is that it's the process of transferring ideas from one thing to another thing. All right, so we're going to start with an example. And this is an example of a metaphor because it's not the sergeant barked, because it's not actually saying that the sergeant actually barked. That is, that he said woof or made some kind of dog-like sound. It's a way of communicating something about his manner, his personality, his behavior, and other information that's relevant to that context. So, but to understand what this means, we really need to unpack it. But first, a few key points about the information in this sentence. All right, we need to remember that people shout. The sergeant is a person, so he shouts, he doesn't actually bark. Dogs bark. So we could just say that the sergeant shouted, but that doesn't actually explain why the word barked is used. And the decision to say barked instead of shout is the reason why we use metaphors in the first place. And so it's why we need to unpack this metaphor. All right, so this is an example of an implied metaphor. And it's implying here that because he's barking, that the sergeant is a dog. So what does that mean? The point of a metaphor is to transfer the characteristics of one idea to another, like we said earlier. And in this case, the characteristics of a dog are being transferred to the sergeant to communicate something about that sergeant. When we unpack a metaphor, you can imagine that the new idea is a package that brings with it a whole range of things that can be applied to the original. So it helps to make a little bit of a brainstorm, like I've done here, of all the things that we know about dogs when we're trying to unpack this metaphor of saying that the sergeant is a dog. We've got a whole range of different things, from aggressive, loyal, smelly, obedient, all of those. But we need to work out which ones are the most relevant, because not all of them are going to be relevant to this particular example. And in this example, the idea that dogs are aggressive, loud, and dangerous are what we transfer to our understanding of the sergeant and the sergeant's behavior. So we can say that in this metaphor, it's telling us that the sergeant is loud, aggressive, probably dangerous, and therefore someone that is a threat. So you'll notice that the analysis here is a lot longer than the actual sentence. That's because we use metaphors for more than one reason. While they are great at helping explain things using something familiar, they're also a far more efficient way of communicating more complex ideas. So in this case, we say barked, but we communicate far more information about the behavior of the sergeant in the situation. So you can see that I've used this sentence. The metaphor shows us that the sergeant is loud, aggressive, and probably dangerous. And it's probably helpful to use this sentence stem while you get the hang of doing this. All right, so let's take a look at another example, this one from Romeo and Juliet. In this example, Benvolio is trying to convince Romeo that he's wasting his time with this girl, Rosalind, and that there's really nothing all that special about her, that Romeo's just imagining it. So Benvolio points out that Romeo thinks Rosalind is a swan, when she, according to Benvolio, is really a crow. So let's start by unpacking the first part where Romeo believes Rosalind is a swan. Okay, and in this, Romeo is transferring all of these attributes about swans to his current love interest, Rosalind. So we've got, when we unpack the idea of a swan, we've got that they're refined, elegant, rare, regal, graceful, elusive, so on and so forth. And then we can identify the ones that are probably the most appropriate in this example. These are the ideas that Benvolio says Romeo transfers to Rosalind, and the ones that Benvolio believes Romeo is imagining. So the idea that she's refined, elegant, beautiful, graceful. So if we then go back to our sentence stem, we get the following. The metaphor shows us that Romeo believes that Rosalind is elegant, graceful, beautiful, and refined. Alright, so now it's going to be your turn. This time we'll look at the second half of the quote, which is what Benvolio thinks about Rosalind. In this one, Benvolio is transferring the ideas associated with crows to Rosalind. So what you need to do is unpack that by brainstorming all the attributes of crows, and then identify the most relevant ones. And finally, once you've done that, you can use the sentence stem to summarize what this shows about Rosalind. And that's it. It just leaves us with one thing. Have you worked out why unpacking metaphors is a metaphor?